Well, hello there and welcome to episode 14 of B.Hooked TV. I'm your host, Brittany, and if you're brand new to the show here, welcome. My sole purpose here is to try and be your guide to better crochet and knitting through episodes just like this one. Now, in today's show, we're going to get a little bit tactical. So you heard in episode 11 why you need to make a gauge swatch and why it's so important. And then in episode 12, we looked at how you can use a gauge swatch, so why you would even want to do it in the first place. Well, now today I want to show you exactly how to make your gauge swatch and how to read it. All right, now before we get to it, please subscribe to the show. I would love for you to join me each and every week so you can learn some crochet and knit and yarn techniques, sort of get your crochet and your knit fix for the week. And you can do that by subscribing to the show. So go ahead and hit the subscribe button and let's talk about those gauge swatches. Okay, so when making your gauge swatch, the first thing you'll want to do is pull up your pattern. Find the gauge section within that pattern and either take a mental note or even write it down. Look at the stitch pattern because that's going to tell you what you're going to crochet in or knit in for your gauge swatch. And then look at that measurement. Is it telling you that your gauge is measured across 4 inches, 2 inches, 1 inch? I mean, most common you're going to see 4 inches, but just take note of that as well. That's going to tell you how big you need your swatch to be. Now for stitch patterns where the multiple is really straightforward, if you're just working in single crochet or garter stitch or half double crochet, double crochet, anything that has a multiple of 1, you really don't have to put too much attention or focus on that foundation chain or the cast on number of stitches for that swatch. But if you're working in a fancier or a specific stitch pattern that works across a multiple, you can usually find that in your pattern as well. Somewhere in the notes section, it might tell you that the stitch pattern is worked across a multiple of X number of stitches, and you'll want to keep that in mind as you're making your swatches. So let's look at a really basic example here, working in single crochet. I know there's a lot of patterns out there who are listing this gauge. It's really your segue into making gauge swatches and figuring out what all this is for and why it's so important to you. So let's keep it really simple for this video. And of course, we can always elaborate this a little bit more in the future. So your starting point is the hook size that's given in the pattern and of course the recommended yarn. So you'll make your foundation chains and just have a little ruler there handy next to you so you can lay the foundation chain and look at it and say, okay, I have at least have 5 inches worth of chains here, so I know I'm good to go. Now when you're working with a single crochet, of course you have that turning chain, so you want to have 1 extra in this particular instance, and it's off to the races. All you need to do is single crochet back and forth until it measures at least 5 inches tall. Now, once you've finished your gauge swatch, you can fasten off as normal, and then you can do one of 2 things. You can either take your measurement right away, or you can block and perhaps even wash your swatch before you take your measurements. Now, it depends on how nitty-gritty you want to get with this in terms of what you do next. For me, my rule of thumb is whatever I plan to do with my project, that's what I should also do with my swatch. So when you're measuring your gauge, what you should use is some type of hard ruler or a gauge measuring device. Now my Tulip Edimo crochet hook set came with this hard ruler. It's actually just made of plastic and it goes up to about 4.5 inches, which is perfect for the gauge on most patterns. So if you have the Tulip Edimo set, I would recommend using this or any other kid's ruler, just whatever you can find in the store. Now, there's another option available too, and this one is by Susan Bates, and it's specifically for measuring your gauge. Now you'll see a few different things going on here. Now what I use most often with this particular device is just the ruler on the bottom, because this one goes to a 4 inch, it actually goes up to a 5 inch, and I will really just lay this along my stitches and use the bottom. Then I'll rotate it when I'm counting the rows. So let's have a closer look at how to measure your swatch. Make sure you're aligning the edge of your ruler to one of your stitches. When you're counting the stitches for gauge, it's also really important to count or factor in the space between the stitches because that does play into the distance from one stitch to the next. And then I'll simply count how many stitches are in my 4 inches. Now let's check the row height. Same thing, we'll align our ruler at the top edge of one of our rows, and I will count down. All right, so now that you have seen how to read your gauge swatches, well, what do you even do with this information? This is the fun part. When your gauge matches, you're good to go. So if you count exactly the number of stitches in your row and exactly the number of rows within that measurement that it gives, 4 inches for our example here, then you don't have to do anything. You're good to go, your gauge matches the designer's, and you can proceed with confidence that you're going to have enough yarn for the project and that it's going to fit as it should. But what do you do when your gauge doesn't match? Well, that means your crochet style is just a little bit different than the designer's, and if you were to ignore this information and proceed, you would have an issue possibly with the amount of yarn that you have. You may run out, you may have too much, or you're going to run into an issue where the sizing will be completely off. If you are in a situation where your gauge is different than what's listed in your pattern, and let's say you're counting more stitches in your row measurement, okay? More stitches in your row measurement, that means that your gauge is smaller and you need to compensate for that by going up a hook size. That's a good starting point for me. If it's way, way off, like if you have several stitches more, then you might want to go up 2 hook sizes, but a good rule of thumb is to go up 1. That will usually get the job done. Alternative to that, if you count fewer stitches in your gauge measurement, then that means your gauge is bigger than the designer's and you need to go down a hook size. Okay, so I wanted to tackle that row portion of the gauge all on its own because this is sort of a different beast. In most cases, you'll find that your row height is good. It's spot on. However, if you find yourself counting more rows than what the pattern lists, then that has to do with crochet height and basically how you're working those stitches. So when you are inserting your hook into the stitch, you yarn over, you pull up your loop. However high you pull that really determines the height of the stitch. If you're like me and you keep your hook really close to that yarn in the project, then you will have shorter rows. If you, on the flip side, are pulling up really high when you do your yarn overs, then you're going to have a taller stitch. And that's what makes up for that difference in row height. So with gauge, you don't always have to change your crochet style, but if you're having a really big issue with row height, you kind of do. Now, one person could argue that, oh, it's just row height, it's not a big deal. And that's true some of the time. But in the instance where the height is a factor, for example, garments, then you really do want to pay attention to that. And you could potentially just compensate if you know the length that particular piece of the pattern is supposed to be, then you can crochet fewer or more rows. These are just a couple of different options. Either way, if your gauge is off in any way, you will have to do some adjusting in order for your project to turn out the size that's listed in your pattern. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with here is just to stress the importance of getting your gauge as close as possible to what you see in the pattern. Remember that the difference is going to compound through your project because the gauge is really just taking a snapshot of the pattern. The bottom line is it's a judgment call. My goal for this episode was really just to break it down as simple as possible so you have all the facts. I don't want to sway you in one direction or another. I just want you to know the facts so that you can take them and apply it to your particular situation right now, and you can make an educated guess on how to move forward. All right, now if you have another question that's related to gauge, please leave that in the comment section below. Gauge is such a big topic, and I want it to be something that you understand and not something that you dread. Please leave that in the comment section. I will definitely try to get that on the schedule so I can help you with those gauge struggles. All right, now that'll do for another episode of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure. I just love filming these videos for you. I really have a blast with it, and I'm glad you're enjoying them as well. Now, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the show and hit the like button. If you loved this video, if you found any value in it, by hitting the like button, it lets me know that I'm on the right track, that I'm actually making content that is important to you. And that's my goal. All right, now I'll see you next week with another episode of B.Hooked TV. Bye for now.